The Hale estate had stood on the same 12 acres of Buckhead land for 31 years, long enough that the magnolias Douglas planted the year his son was born had grown taller than the second-floor windows and cast shadows across the east lawn every morning from October through March. The house itself was white-column Georgian revival, the kind of architecture that announced permanence without apology. Black shutters, a circular drive of pale crushed stone, a fountain at the center that ran year-round, because Douglas had once read that moving water suggested confidence, and confidence was the one thing a man in his position could never afford to misplace. He had built Hale Property Group from a single commercial listing in 1987 into one of the Southeast's most recognized real estate development firms, and the house reflected every decade of that climb. The East Wing added in 1999, the library expansion in 2004, the renovation of the carriage house into a proper guest suite the year Elliot was born. Everything about the property said that the man who lived here had thought of everything. That was the version Douglas Hale had believed about himself until the middle of November, when his 10-year-old son stopped getting out of bed. It was a Tuesday in early January when Miriam Voss arrived for work at 7:15, the same time she had arrived every weekday for the past 6 years, parking her 2009 Honda Civic at the end of the service drive, the way she always did, leaving enough room for the grounds crew van that came Thursdays. She wore a dark cardigan over her work clothes and carried a canvas bag with her lunch inside and a library book she had been reading for 3 weeks, because her days did not leave much room for sitting still. Cora was with her. School was closed for a teacher in-service day, and the alternative was leaving her daughter with Mrs. Pemberton 2 doors down, which Miriam would not do again after the incident in October involving a hot plate and an unsupervised cat. So Cora came as she had come on similar days before, quiet and self-contained, in the way of children who had learned early that the best way to stay somewhere you were not entirely supposed to be was to make yourself easy to overlook. Cora was 9 years old and small for her age in a way that misled people into expecting softness. She had her mother's dark eyes and her mother's habit of watching a room before committing to it, but where Miriam watched in order to navigate carefully, Cora watched in order to understand completely. She sat at the far end of the kitchen island with her backpack at her feet and a worksheet open on the counter in front of her, a pencil tucked behind her ear, and she looked at the worksheet only occasionally. Mostly she looked at the kitchen itself, at the granite countertops laid with the morning's breakfast preparations, at the copper pots hanging from the ceiling rack above the center island, at the small framed chalkboard near the pantry door where the week's meal schedule was written in careful block letters, and at Aldous Crane, who stood near the coffee station with his clipboard and his expression of thin professional patience, waiting for Miriam to finish signing the supply inventory sheet so he could move on to the next item on his morning list. Aldous Crane had managed the Hale estate for 11 years. He was 52 and carried himself with the compressed authority of a man who had spent a decade and a half translating a wealthy employer's preferences into operational policy, a skill that had made him indispensable and, in his estimation, somewhat underappreciated. He wore pressed khakis and a collared shirt every day, regardless of weather or occasion, and he communicated primarily in the language of process schedules, inventories, vendor contacts, and what he referred to as the household's operational integrity, a phrase he used so frequently that the kitchen staff had developed a private shorthand for it that he was not aware of. He looked at Miriam the way he looked at all the domestic staff, with a particular brand of courteous condescension reserved for people whose work he depended on and whose presence he considered a logistical variable rather than a human fact. Miriam signed the inventory sheet without comment and handed the clipboard back. She had been signing inventory sheets, polishing the second-floor hallway floors, laundering the Hale family's linens, and managing the seasonal deep cleaning rotations for 6 years without complaint and without incident, which was the only performance review that mattered in a house like this. She was 38 and had come to the job through a domestic staffing agency after the factory where she had worked for 4 years moved its operations overseas. She had a GED and a certificate in professional housekeeping services from a community program in Marietta, and she was better at her job than anyone in the house acknowledged out loud, which was the arrangement she had accepted, because accepting it was what the situation required. What the situation did not require, she had come to understand over 3 months of carefully worded conversations with Aldous Crane, was the payment of her wages on any schedule that inconvenienced the estate's current financial priorities. November's paycheck had arrived 11 days late. December's had not arrived at all. The explanation delivered by Crane with the fluency of a man who had rehearsed it involved internal accounting adjustments, a temporary reallocation of household reserve funds, and the assurance that everything would be reconciled in the new year. Miriam had nodded. She had gone home and paid her electric bill with the last of her savings account and told Cora that the Christmas presents would be a little later this year because the mail was slow, and Cora had looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said, okay, in a tone that told Miriam her daughter was not fooled, but was choosing not to add to her mother's weight. Cora finished the first section of her worksheet and turned it over. She had noticed the cork board near the service hallway door when she came in. She noticed most things within 30 seconds of entering a room, and on the cork board, partially obscured by a vendor calendar and a list of weekly tasks, was a single sheet of paper printed on Hale Property Group letterhead. She had read it from across the room when Crane's back was turned. She was a careful reader, the kind who absorbed language in a single pass and retained it precisely, and what the sheet of paper said had settled into her mind and stayed there the way important things did, quietly without urgency, waiting for the right moment to become relevant. Douglas came downstairs at 8:10. He moved through the kitchen without the particular focused energy of a man with a destination. He moved the way people moved when they were occupying space rather than using it. And Cora watched him stop at the coffee station, pour a cup. He then sat down without drinking and stand at the window above the sink, looking out at the east lawn where the morning light was still thin and gray across the dormant grass. He was 63 and looked at in some ways the silver in his hair was complete, and his face carried the kind of settled gravity that came from 4 decades of consequential decisions, but he moved like a younger man, or had until recently. What Cora noticed was not his age, but his stillness. He stood at that window with the particular immobility of someone who had run out of productive actions and had not yet found a way to accept that stillness might be its own kind of answer. He had spent 2 months pursuing answers of the more familiar kind. Dr. Fenwick had been the first, a well-regarded pediatric specialist from Emory who had examined Elliot in mid-November and ordered blood work, a neurological screening, and a follow-up consultation with a colleague who specialized in pediatric fatigue presentations. The colleague had come and ordered additional tests. A third physician had been brought in from a practice in Charleston whose reputation in complex pediatric cases Douglas had read about in a profile in Atlanta magazine. 2 more had followed, recommended through private channels that wealthy people maintain for exactly these situations, the channels that bypass standard referrals and waiting lists and deposited you directly at the desk of whoever was considered the best available mind on a given problem. All 5 had examined Elliot. All 5 had conducted their assessments with the careful thoroughness of professionals who understood that the man paying them was not interested in uncertainty. And all 5 had delivered their findings in the language of sophisticated inconclusiveness. No organic pathology identified, presentation consistent with a stress-related syndrome, recommend ongoing monitoring. Consider consultation with a pediatric behavioral specialist. Follow up in 30 days. Elliot had been 10 years old since August. He had started 5th grade at Hargrove Preparatory Academy. In September, the same school his father had attended, the same school whose name was etched above the entrance in the kind of sans serif stone lettering that communicated institutional seriousness without effort. He had been, by every parental account, a healthy child, slight and quiet in the way of bookish boys fond of drawing, passively interested in baseball, largely because his father had given him a glove at age 7, with the specific hope of creating a shared language between them. He had never been gregarious. He had never been the kind of child who needed to be in the middle of things. But he had been functional present, moving through the ordinary days of his life with the unremarkable steadiness that parents only recognize as a gift after it was gone. In the third week of September, he began complaining of stomach aches on Sunday evenings. By October, the complaints had expanded to include headaches on school mornings, a persistent tiredness that resisted both sleep and rest, and a pallor that his pediatrician initially attributed to the seasonal shift in light. By the first week of November, he had stopped going to school entirely, and by mid-November, the stomach aches and headaches had been joined by a low-grade nausea that appeared most reliably in the hours between 7 and 9 in the morning, and resolved with notable consistency by midday on days when school attendance was not in question. This pattern had been documented in Dr. Fenwick's notes as clinically suggestive of anxiety-adjacent somatic presentation, a phrase that meant in the translation that plain language required that the doctor suspected the body was performing a fear that the child had not named out loud. Doctor. Fenwick had shared this possibility with Douglas during their third consultation. Douglas had thanked him and asked what other physiological conditions might produce the same pattern. It was a question that revealed with some precision the limit of what Douglas was prepared to hear. Miriam moved from the kitchen into the East Service corridor, beginning her morning routine with the methodical efficiency of someone who had internalized the layout of the house so completely that she could have navigated it in darkness. Cora remained at the island with her worksheet, but the worksheet was finished now, and she was not starting the next page. She was watching Douglas at the window, studying him with the attentive seriousness she brought to things that seemed important and unresolved. She had seen the sheet on the corkboard. She had read it twice to be certain. $20,000 for any person who could provide meaningful guidance toward Elliot's recovery. That was the language Douglas had used, formal and careful, the language of a man accustomed to structuring proposals. She had noticed that he had placed it on the staff corkboard rather than advertising it publicly, which meant he did not want the attention a public announcement would bring, only the possibility that someone in the household's orbit might know something the specialists had missed. The sheet had been printed on a Tuesday, she estimated, from its placement beneath the vendor calendar, which was updated every Tuesday morning. It had been there for at least a week. No one had responded. Cora thought about this with the quiet systematism that characterized her thinking. She was 9 years old and understood with the matter-of-fact clarity of children who grow up watching money work from the outside exactly what $20,000 meant in the context of her mother's life. She also understood from the hours she had spent in this house, watching everyone in it, something that the 5 specialists apparently had not. She did not fully understand how she understood it, only that when she had looked at Elliot's door at the top of the stairs, closed with the particular closeness of a room that had been closed for months, she had felt with some precision the difference between a door that was closed because someone was resting and a door that was closed because someone was hiding. Douglas turned from the window when Aldous Crane entered the kitchen to report on the morning schedule. Cora listened to the exchange, a call at 9 from the Nashville office, a contractor meeting at 11 regarding the East Wing gutters, a delivery of medical supplies for Elliot's room at 2, and watched Douglas absorb each item with the absent processing of a man whose attention was housed somewhere else entirely. When Crane finished, Douglas set his untouched coffee cup in the sink and turned toward the hallway. He was halfway across the kitchen floor when Cora got down from the stool. She did not call out to him. She walked directly to the entrance of the main hall and stood there in the threshold between the services side of the house and the formal side and waited until Douglas was 3 steps from the base of the curved staircase. Then she spoke, and her voice carried the kind of steady quiet that did not need volume to command attention. "Pay my mother what she's owed first. Then I'll save your son." Douglas Hale stopped moving. The house held the particular morning silence of large, empty spaces, the distant sound of a vacuum from somewhere upstairs, the faint mechanical hum of the fountain through the sidelight windows, the muffled sound of Miriam's footsteps in the corridor beyond the kitchen door. And in the middle of all that ordinary sound, the silence around Douglas's stillness was something different. It was the silence of a man who had not in recent memory been surprised. He turned slowly the way people turned when they wanted to give themselves a moment to decide what expression to put on before completing the rotation. He looked at Cora in the hallway threshold, small, dark-haired, standing with her hands at her sides and her chin at a precise and unhurried angle. And what crossed his face was not anger, not amusement, not the patrician dismissal that Crane would have deployed. It was something more unsettling than any of those things. It was the involuntary attention of a man who had been searching for certainty for 2 months and had just heard from an entirely improbable source a sentence that contained it. Aldous Crane came through from the kitchen behind Cora, having heard the exchange, and his expression arranged itself into the particular configuration of professional distress that situations like this demanded from estate managers. His voice carried the clipped authority of a man accustomed to restoring order to irregular moments. "Mr. Hale, I apologize. Miriam's daughter accompanied her today. I'll make sure she stays in the service." Douglas raised one hand without looking at Crane, and Crane stopped speaking. The gesture was small and absolute, the kind of authority that did not need to raise its voice because it had never needed to. Douglas kept his eyes on Cora for a moment longer than was comfortable, and Cora held his gaze with the equanimity of someone who had decided before opening her mouth that she was not going to be the first one to look away. Cornelia Hale came into the foyer from the breakfast room hallway at that exact moment, wearing a cashmere cardigan in a shade of deep teal and the pearl stud earrings she wore every day, without exception because she had stopped dressing for events and started dressing for standards, which was a distinction her mother had made and that she had taken several decades to understand. She was 58 with the kind of composed face that recorded emotion in small, precise increments rather than large theatrical ones. And she read a room the way people read when they had done it long enough to get to the meaning before the first paragraph finished. She looked at Cora. She looked at her husband. She looked at the particular quality of the air between them and understood that something had already happened before she arrived. "Douglas," her voice was even informational with the thin edge of a question in it. Douglas still did not look away from Cora. "She says she can help Elliot." Cornelia's eyes moved back to Cora, not with skepticism, not with the reflexive adult dismissal of a child's claim, but with the steady assessment of a woman accustomed to evaluating what was in front of her without the interference of what she expected to find. "You said something else first," Cornelia said to Cora. "The child did not hedge. My mother has not been paid for November or December. I said pay her first, then I'll tell you what I know about your son." The foyer held that sentence for a moment. Crane made a sound that was not quite a word, but communicated strongly that he considered this an operational emergency of the first order. Cornelia turned to her husband, and the quality of her gaze shifted not toward Cora now, but toward Douglas with the specific focus of a woman who had just noticed that her husband had not immediately denied the claim. Douglas, not a question this time. His jaw held the compressed tension of a man deciding between several inadequate responses. It was temporary. The reserve fund was being November and December. Cornelia said it the way you repeated something when you needed it to be heard correctly. You held Miriam's wages for 2 months. The medical consultants. How much did Dr. Fenwick's team cost in total? The pause before he answered was its own answer. Cornelia turned to Crane with the brisk precision of a woman who had been making decisions in this house, alongside a man who sometimes forgot to involve her and had long since stopped waiting for an invitation to correct that oversight. "Aldous call, accounting's how. I want Miriam paid in full for both months before noon." Crane looked at Douglas. Douglas gave the smallest possible nod. Miriam had appeared in the kitchen doorway, somewhere in the middle of all this, drawn by the sound of her daughter's voice in a part of the house where her daughter was not supposed to be, and she stood now with one hand on the doorframe and the particular expression of a mother watching her child do something she had not authorized and could not entirely stop. Her face was the careful neutral of someone maintaining composure in a situation where composure costs something. Her eyes went to Cora with a look that carried more than the scene could hold, pride and terror in equal measure, pressing against each other in a way that only mothers of certain daughters ever learned to contain. Cora. The single word was a leash, a prayer, and a warning all at once. Sweetheart, that is not, Mama. Cora said it without turning around, and the gentleness in it was absolute. Let me finish. Miriam's hand tightened on the doorframe. She did not speak again, but she did not leave. Douglas descended the final 3 steps from the staircase landing and stood in the foyer proper 6 feet from Cora, regarding her with the full and serious attention he ordinarily reserved for contract negotiations and situations that had the potential to go significantly wrong in ways that mattered. He was a tall man and Cora was a small child, and the scale of the thing should have made the moment absurd. It did not. You understand what you're saying? It was not a question. It was the beginning of an accounting. Yes, sir. My son has been ill since November. I've had 5 physicians in this house, specialists from Emory, from Charleston, from New York. I've spent, he paused, and the pause was its own statement about the number, a significant amount of money on consultants and testing and equipment. Every one of them has looked at Elliot and told me they cannot find what's wrong. He held her gaze steadily. And you're telling me you can. I'm telling you I know something they don't. Cora did not soften this or qualify it. But I said pay my mother first. That part isn't the bargain. That's just what's right. The last sentence landed differently than anything else she had said. Cornelia looked at her husband with an expression that had moved past the immediate issue of wages into something more uncomfortable. The recognition that a 9-year-old child had in 4 words articulated a moral position that several adults in the room had been carefully not articulating for 2 months. Douglas looked at his wife. He looked at the child. He unfolded his arms, a small movement that people who watched him closely recognized as the physical shift that preceded a decision. All right, he said. When Miriam is paid, you'll tell me what you know. Yes, sir. A beat precise as a period. And if I'm right about your son, the $20,000 on the corkboard still stands. Crane made a strangled sound. Miriam closed her eyes. Douglas Hale, for the first time that morning, looked at something other than the middle distance. He looked at Cora with an expression that had moved past calculation into something rarer, something that sat in the difficult territory between unwilling respect and the discomfort of being outmaneuvered by someone who weighed 60 pounds. You read the staff board. You put it there for staff to read. The corner of his mouth moved in a way that did not complete itself into anything as uncomplicated as a smile. Come upstairs, he said. The stairs were wide and curved and lined on the inner wall with the framed documentation of the Hale family's accumulated decade school photographs. Vacation shots, a formal portrait from a decade ago, when Elliot had been an infant and Douglas and Cornelia had been younger, in ways that showed most clearly around the eyes. Cora climbed beside Douglas without touching the banister, looking straight ahead, and Miriam came behind with the watchful proximity of a mother who had decided that if this was happening, she was going to be present for all of it. Cornelia walked on Cora's other side in silence, which was its own form of endorsement. The second-floor hallway ran the full length of the house's main wing and was floored in the same wide plank oak as the down stair, covered at intervals with wool runners in deep navy and burgundy. The portraits here were older Douglas's parents, a formal photograph of the firm's first completed project, a landscape painting of the Georgia coast that Cornelia had chosen, and Douglas had grown attached to in the way people grew attached to things their spouses loved. At the far end of the hall, a set of double doors painted a muted blue-gray were closed with the particular closed quality of a room that had not been opened casually in some time. Douglas paused with his hand on the knob. The pause was brief. Most people in the house had stopped noticing it, but Cora noticed it. He was bracing, she understood. Not against what he might find inside, since he had been inside many times, but against the possibility that whatever hope he had admitted by bringing this child upstairs was about to dissolve the moment the door opened and everything looked exactly as it had looked for the past 2 months. He opened the door. The room was large and warm and arranged with the meticulous attention of people who were doing everything they could think of and needed the environment to reflect that effort. Heavy curtains in a soft gray blue had been drawn halfway against the January light, leaving the room in a warm dimness that was medical in its quality, the dimness of a space recalibrated for a body that was supposed to be recovering. A side table held a tray with a bowl of broth and crackers that had not been touched. The bookshelves along the east wall held a careful arrangement of Elliot's belongings, framed photographs, a collection of model aircraft that had been assembled over 3 years with Douglas's help, a row of paperback adventure novels with bent spines, and on the second shelf from the bottom, leaning against a stack of graphic novels, a baseball glove in brown leather, soft and broken in at the pocket that had not been moved in at least 2 months. Elliot was in the bed, propped against a stack of white pillows covered to his waist by a navy throw. He was 10 years old and slight, with dark hair that fell across his forehead at the angle it always fell, and he had the careful, composed expression of a child who had been looked at by a great many adults recently and had developed a face for it, a face that said, "I am managing this. I am being cooperative. I am not going to make this harder for anyone." It was a face that looked to most of the adults who had seen it like the face of a sick child maintaining dignity. It was not, Cora understood the moment she saw it, the face of a child who was primarily sick. It was the face of a child who was primarily tired, not tired from illness, tired from the sustained effort of being somewhere he did not want to be, performing a version of himself he had decided was necessary, and hoping that the performance would hold long enough for the thing he was hiding from to go away on its own. Douglas crossed the room to the bedside with the direct and purposeful movement of a man entering a room where someone he loved was suffering, the movement of someone who had been crossing this particular room in this particular way for 2 months and had not yet found the right thing to do when he reached the bed. "Hey, bud." The words were careful, carrying less weight than they wanted to. "How are you feeling?" Elliot's answer came in the register of a child who had given this answer many times, tired. The single word smooth and rehearsed, landing exactly where it was supposed to land and telling in its very smoothness something true. Cornelia came to stand on the other side of the bed near the window. She touched the throw near Elliot's knee, a small contact, proprietary and gentle, and said, "Elliot, this is Cora. She's Miriam's daughter. She'd like to talk with you a little." Elliot looked at Cora. Something crossed his face very quickly, a flicker the way a fish moves below the surface and is gone before you fully register it. Not fear, not the practiced neutral of a sick child assessing a new adult authority. Something else. Something that looked in that fraction of a second before his expression restabilized, like the surprise of someone who had just been seen by someone they did not expect to be capable of seeing them. Cora stepped forward to the bedside without waiting to be directed there. She did not look at Douglas or Cornelia. She looked at Elliot the way she had looked at Douglas in the foyer, directly, without the softening layer that most adults place between themselves and children they were trying to reassure. "Can I talk to him?" she asked, addressing the question to Douglas behind her. "You're talking to him now." The response came from a man who was still at some level operating in the register of authority. I mean, without everybody looking at him like he's a problem they're trying to solve. She said it without edge, as a statement of practical logistics, and it landed in the room the way her sentences had a habit of landing, with the particular weight of things that were true and had been waiting to be said by someone with no investment in leaving them unsaid. Douglas's expression tightened at its edges. He was a man who had spent decades being the authority in rooms he entered and being redirected by this child for the second time in 20 minutes, with the same unadorned directness produced in him. Something complex, irritation, and the unwilling recognition that the irritation was in some proportion a response to being right. Cornelia's hand moved to his sleeve the way it had learned to move over 34 years of marriage when she wanted to communicate something she was not going to say out loud. He stepped back from the bed, not far, but back. Cora stood at Elliot's bedside and said, "Hey." The word was simple enough to be almost nothing, and it was for that reason exactly the right beginning. It did not inquire about his condition. It did not project sympathy or concern or the particular brand of adult hopefulness that Elliot had been sitting at the center of for 2 months. It was just an acknowledgement: you are here, I am here. The space between us has no agenda. The corners of Elliot's mouth moved. Barely enough. "Hey, you look like you get worse when grown people ask how you feel." Elliot's fingers moved against the throw. Not a flinch, something more interesting than a flinch. The instinctive tightening of someone who had just been seen through a wall they thought was solid. His voice came out quieter than before. "I am tired." Cora looked around the room without hurry, at the untouched broth, at the model aircraft, at the baseball glove on the shelf. Then she looked back at Elliot. "Maybe, but I don't think that's the whole thing." Douglas made a sound that was the beginning of an interjection. Cornelia's hand moved again. He held. Elliot looked down at the throw. His fingers worked at a small section of the navy fabric, pressing and releasing it in a rhythm that had the quality of an old habit. The silence in the room was the particular silence that forms when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone is waiting to see what it becomes. Cora did not press. She did not lean forward. She waited with the patience of someone who understood that the truth would come out on its own schedule, and that the only way to interrupt that schedule was to make the person holding it feel cornered. She looked at the baseball glove again. "You used to play." Elliot followed her eyes to the shelf. "With my dad." The words came more easily than the previous ones. Easier, not because they were safer, but because they were real, and real things, Cora had noticed, often traveled faster than performed ones. "Before," he paused. The word before hung in the room and expanded. "Last spring. Do you miss it?" He nodded. One small movement, honest. "Do you miss school?" The shift was immediate and visible to everyone in the room. Not a dramatic collapse, nothing like that. The change was smaller and more telling than that. The careful composure that Elliot had been wearing since the door opened developed for just a moment, a texture, a hesitation at the surface, a fault line running through the patience of a child who had been holding something for longer than a child should have to hold it. His breathing changed by a measure that was almost nothing and entirely significant. His shoulders drew inward by half an inch. Cornelia whispered, "Elliot." He shook his head once sharp, a child's attempt to refuse his way out of an emotion he didn't want witnessed. "No," Cora said. "Okay." He looked at her. The okay surprised him. It was not followed by a clarifying question or a redirect or the particular gentle persistence of adults who believe that pushing through a child's resistance was the same as helping. It was just okay. A door left open rather than forced. "Okay," Cora said again. "If you don't want to say it yet, but something happened there." The room contracted around those three words. Douglas straightened. Cornelia pressed her lips together. Miriam stood at the doorway with one hand against the frame and watched her daughter do the thing that Miriam had raised her to do without ever intending to teach it. She watched Cora hold space for someone else's fear without filling it with her own need to fix it, and felt the complex pride of a mother watching her child be better at something than she had ever been herself. Elliot looked down at the throw. The fault line at the surface of his composure widened by one more increment, and what was visible through it now was not illness. It was the specific fear of a child standing at the edge of a secret he had been carrying alone and was no longer entirely certain he had the strength to keep. Douglas moved to the chair beside the bed and sat down. Not with authority, not with the managed proximity of a parent maintaining professional concern. He simply sat the way people sat when they had run out of the energy required to remain standing above a situation and had decided to join it at ground level instead. The motion was small, and it changed everything about his posture. He looked sitting there not like a man who managed things. He looked like a father. "We are going to be honest in this room." The statement was direct and controlled and carried in it the last remnant of the authority he was actively in the process of releasing. Do you understand me? Elliot nodded. Douglas stopped before completing his next sentence. He looked at Cora, something he had not expected to do, and what he was looking for without fully knowing it was permission to ask the question more carefully than his first instinct had formed it. Cora said nothing, but something in her stillness communicated with the particular eloquence of people who understood silence as a form of instruction that the question he was about to ask was the wrong question, and that the right question was smaller and would require him to know his son differently than he currently did. Douglas held the wrong question. He sat with it. The room let him. Cornelia crouched beside the bed so that she was at Elliot's level rather than above it, the gesture involuntary and entirely maternal, the body's knowledge overriding the adult instinct to maintain height as a form of composed authority. Her voice went to something that had no performance in it at all. Sweetheart, if someone has been frightening you or hurting you or making you dread going somewhere, you have to tell us. Elliot did not look at either of his parents. He looked at Cora. That look, that small, specific, unerring orientation toward the one person in the room who had not yet asked him for anything traveled through Douglas Hale like something cold and clarifying. He felt it in the way you felt things that were true about yourself that you had been paying not to know. His son, in the moment he most needed to trust, had turned not to his father, not to his mother, but to a child who had been in his house for a few hours and had spent most of that time in the kitchen doing homework. Cora held Elliot's gaze without flinching. She said quietly, without accusation, without drama, with the plain and merciful directness that was the particular gift of children who had never learned to soften truth into palatability. You don't have to say it all at once. Something in Elliot's face gave way. Not a breakdown, not a confession, something smaller and more irreversible than both the particular give of a child who has been bracing against a door that has finally stopped being pushed from the other side and has discovered with a physical shock that stopping costs everything the bracing cost. His chin dropped. His shoulders drew further in. His eyes filled not quickly, but with the slow resistance of someone who had been refusing to cry for a considerable period of time and whose body was finally conducting a negotiation his will was losing. Douglas looked at his son and saw for the first time in 2 months of tests and consultants and specialist opinions exactly what he was looking at. Not a medical mystery, a frightened boy. A boy who had decided somewhere around the 3rd week of September that the particular fear he was carrying was not safe to bring home and had found the only exit available to him and had stayed in that exit for so long that it had become the room itself. Cora did not move closer. She did not reach for Elliot or reassure him or deploy any of the adult gestures of comfort that tended to redirect a child's attention from the emotion to the management of it. She stood where she had been standing and let what was real be real, and in that, letting the room change. Douglas looked at her. He did not speak for a moment. When he did, his voice had lost the last of the morning's authority and was left with something more exposed underneath it. The voice of a man who had just understood that he had been asking the wrong questions for 2 months, and that a 9-year-old with a library book in her backpack had found the thing 5 specialists had been paid to find. What do you know? His voice was low, not demanding, asking. Cora looked from Elliot to Douglas and back to Elliot. She spoke the way she had been speaking all morning, with the specific clarity of someone who had decided that precision was a form of kindness, and that vagueness was not in fact more gentle, only more comfortable for the person doing the vague. Your son knows how to look sick, she said. He looks different when you're not watching him. He sits up faster, and he listens like he's trying to figure out who people need him to be before he decides who to be. He's not performing illness because he wants to deceive you. A pause, deliberate. He's performing it because he decided it was the safest thing available. Miriam's breath left her slowly from the doorway. Cornelia covered her mouth with one hand. Douglas Hale sat at the edge of his son's bed in a room full of money and medicine and silence, and looked at the child who had made her mother's wages the price of admission and understood with the cold and humiliating completeness of a man confronted by a truth he had paid an extraordinary amount of money to miss, that what sat before him was not at its root a medical question at all. It was a question about a boy who had needed his father to hear something and had not believed his father was listening. And it was a question about a father who had been so certain that the answer was somewhere in the territory of specialization and expense that he had not once sat down at ground level and asked the smaller question that a 9-year-old girl had asked in the first 5 minutes. The baseball glove sat on the shelf behind Elliot unmoved. The broth on the tray was cold. The room held all of this without judgment, the way rooms did, without any awareness of what it cost to finally arrive at the truth, and without any record of how long the truth had been sitting there, waiting for someone to stop asking the wrong questions long enough to hear it. The morning after Cora spoke the truth in Elliot's room, Douglas woke at 5:14 and did not go back to sleep. He lay in the dark of the master bedroom and listened to the fountain running below the east window and thought about what his son had not yet said, the word that would come later that day, in the particular quiet of a room that had finally stopped pretending to be a hospital. What he knew at 5:14 on a Wednesday morning in January was that his son had looked at a 9-year-old girl with the eyes of someone who had found land after a long swim, and that the direction of that look had told him something about his own house that no amount of diagnostic equipment had been designed to measure. He got up without waking Cornelia, which was its own kind of consideration. She had fallen asleep late sitting in the armchair in the upstairs sitting room, with a yellow legal pad on her lap and the particular stillness of a woman working something through, in the silence her husband did not always think to provide. He had covered her with a throw and left the lamp on low and gone to bed knowing she would find her way to sleep eventually. She always did. She had a practical relationship with rest that Douglas had spent 34 years finding admirable and occasionally maddening in equal measure. He stood at the window in his study on the ground floor with a cup of coffee that was actually hot this time, and he looked out at the east lawn in the pre-dawn dark, and he thought about September. He was good at thinking about September now in the involuntary retrospective way of people who had recently discovered that they had been watching the wrong horizon. He thought about the Sunday evenings when Elliot had come to the dinner table quieter than usual, and he had attributed it to the natural recalibration of a child re-entering a school year routine. He thought about the headaches which Dr. Fenwick had ordered evaluated with a neurological screen that came back negative, and about the mornings when Elliot had moved through the kitchen with the speed and enthusiasm of someone walking towards something they were dreading, and how Douglas had read that slowness as fatigue rather than resistance, because fatigue had a medical category and resistance had only a parenting conversation. And Douglas had never been equally comfortable in both territories. He was thinking about all of this when he heard Cora's voice from the kitchen. She was asking Miriam whether there were any oranges, and Miriam was telling her to look on the second shelf of the refrigerator and not to leave the door open while she was looking, and the ordinary texture of it, the morning sounds of a mother and daughter calibrating their day, in the practical language of available food, moved through Douglas's chest with a weight he had not expected. It was not sentimentality. It was recognition. The house had not sounded like that in some time. It had sounded instead like the house of people managing a situation, and there was a difference he was beginning to understand between a house that was being managed and a house that was being lived in. He set his coffee down and went upstairs. Cora had asked the evening before if she could come back the next day. Not asked, Douglas asked Miriam in the quiet way she managed most of her important requests through the channel she trusted. Miriam had looked at Douglas over Cora's head with the careful expression of a woman who was not going to advocate for her own child in a house where her standing was still, in some respects, being renegotiated. And Douglas had said yes before Cornelia could say it first, which was the right order, though he recognized it was not the order that would have occurred to him a week ago. Elliot was awake when Douglas reached the second floor. The door was open, not the careful open of Cornelia, leaving it ajar. When she checked on him in the night, But the different open of a door left that way from the inside, which was the first variation in the room's routine that Douglas had seen in 6 weeks. He stood in the threshold without announcing himself and looked at his son, who was sitting up in bed with the baseball glove on his lap, turning it over slowly in both hands, with the abstracted attention of someone handling an object that carried weight beyond its material. Douglas did not say anything about the glove. He came into the room and sat in the chair, and Elliot looked up, and they regarded each other in the early morning quiet of the house. And something in the configuration of Elliot's face was different from yesterday. Not better, not recovered, but differently arranged, as though the particular effort required to maintain the sick child composure had been fractionally reduced by the fact that someone had named it. Cora came in 20 minutes later, carrying a glass of orange juice she had poured herself and a piece of toast on a plate that she set on the side table. She did not remark on any of the careful provisions arranged around Elliot's recovery. She looked at the baseball glove. "You took it off the shelf." Elliot looked down at the glove. "It was just sitting there? That's what shelves are for." He almost laughed. The sound was small and quickly contained, but it moved through the room the way a single note moved through a quiet building, not loud but present and leaving a resonance after it. Douglas watched this exchange from the chair with the focused stillness of a man learning something and understanding with uncommon clarity that the learning required him not to interfere. Cora sat cross-legged on the window bench and picked up the plate of toast and took a bite, as though she were in her own kitchen, and the ease of it, the absolute absence of performance, was the thing that made Elliot's shoulders come down by the degree they had not come down for the previous 11 weeks of medical consultations and concerned parental proximity. The question Cora asked that morning was the one that unraveled everything that remained to be unraveled, and she asked it with the same plainness she brought to all her important questions, which was the plainness of someone who had not learned yet to dress difficult things in the soft clothing of indirection. "What's your favorite day of the week?" Elliot blinked. The question was so far outside the expected register, outside the territory of symptoms and assessments and therapeutic inquiries, that it produced in him the brief bewilderment of someone who had prepared extensively for a test and walked into the room to find an entirely different subject on the board. "Saturday." Cora took another bite of toast. "Why?" The answer came before he had time to run it through whatever filter he had been running his answers through for the past 11 weeks. It came the way honest answers came when the defenses were oriented in the wrong direction. Quickly, directly, and with a completeness that surprised the person saying it as much as the person hearing it. "Because I don't have to go to school." The room absorbed this. Douglas felt it enter him the way cold air entered a warm space, the immediate and total recalibration of atmosphere, the sensation of something fundamental shifting from one state to another. He had been waiting for a diagnosis that arrived in medical language, in the vocabulary of pathology and treatment protocol, and what had arrived instead was a single sentence from a 10-year-old boy about a Saturday which contained more information than everything Dr. Fenwick's team had produced in months of testing. Cornelia appeared in the doorway. She had come up quietly, drawn by the changed quality of the silence, the way she had always been able to read the emotional weather of her house through its sounds. She looked at Elliot. She looked at Douglas. She did not speak. Cora did not celebrate the sentence. She did not look at Douglas or Cornelia with the expression of someone whose theory had just been confirmed. She looked at Elliot with the steady patience of someone who understood that the first true thing was only the door, and that what was behind the door still needed to be walked through carefully at the pace of the person who had been holding it shut. "What happens at school?" The answer did not come quickly this time. Elliot turned the baseball glove over in his hands. His thumbs worked at the leather near the wrist strap in the repetitive way of a child managing the distance between something he needed to say and the fear of what saying it would cost him. The silence stretched long enough that Douglas opened his mouth, and Cora, without looking at him, shook her head. One small, unhurried movement. Douglas held. It came in pieces. The way true things often came, not in the complete organized form of an admission, but in the fragmentary, non-sequential order of someone retrieving events that had been stored in the body rather than in the memory, and were therefore coming out in the order of their weight rather than their chronology. The locker room after Friday athletics, the backpack that disappeared in the third week of September and was found in the handicapped bathroom stall, contents scattered across the floor. The shoes moved during lunch to the lost and found bin on the opposite side of the building every Thursday with the consistency of a schedule. The names a curriculum of names delivered in the low register that boys used when they wanted the target to hear and the adults to miss names that addressed built his quietness, his preference for the art room over the basketball court, his reluctance to find the competitive cruelty of certain games enjoyable. Douglas's hands were still on his knees. The stillness was not calm. It was the stillness of a man containing something that wanted very much to become action before the full picture had been assembled. Elliot's voice came lower for the hardest piece. Caleb Holloway says if I tell anyone, he'll just say I'm lying and make it worse. A pause. His dad gave the school a lot of money. The last sentence landed with a precision that was almost architectural. It named not just the threat, but the structure beneath it, the scaffolding of institutional protection that had made the threat credible, that had made the locker room and the Thursdays and the names feel like permanent conditions rather than things that could be stopped. Elliot had understood at 10 years old what the system was. He had understood it before Douglas had. Douglas stood from the chair. The movement was abrupt in the way of men who were accustomed to converting understanding into action within the same breath. And Elliot flinched, not visibly, not dramatically, but Cora saw it and Douglas saw Cora see it, and he stopped. He stood between the chair and the bed and breathed for a moment, and the breathing cost him something, and paying that cost was the most useful thing he had done in the room all morning. Cornelia came fully into the room and sat on the edge of the bed. She put her hand over her son's hand over the glove and held it there. Who else knows about this? Her voice was the voice she used when she was taking measurements, quiet and exact emotion subordinated to the need for information. Elliot's eyes went to the carpet. Mrs. Alderton told them to be kind once. He paused. That's not the same. Cora from the window bench said, no, it's not. Nobody corrected her because nobody could. Douglas was already thinking about the school. He was thinking about it the way he thought about problems that required strategy, assembling the available information, identifying the points of resistance, determining the approach most likely to produce the result he needed without triggering the defensive reorganization that institutions engaged in when they felt themselves under direct attack. He was also thinking about what Cora had said in the foyer the previous morning, the sentence he had been turning over in his mind for 14 hours, don't ask the big question. Ask the small one, the kind a liar hasn't prepared for. He left for Hargrove Preparatory Academy at 9:30 after Cornelia had called the school's main office to inform them of a parent visit and had been told that headmaster Gregor Aldwell would make himself available between 10 and 11. The drive took 22 minutes through the Buckhead roads that ran between stone walls and established winter lawns past the churches and the private clubs and the historic properties that constituted the neighborhood's commitment to the idea that some things should remain exactly as they had always been. Douglas drove it without music and without calls, which was unusual for him, and used the time to prepare, not the speech he would ordinarily have prepared, but the questions, small, specific, the kind that arrived sideways at the thing they were really asking. Hargrove Preparatory Academy sat on a rise of carefully maintained land at the end of a tree-lined approach road. The campus presented its familiar face brick in white trim, the old oaks, the flag at the circular drive, the Latin motto above the main entrance, carved in a serif font that had been selected in 1962 for its associations with permanence and classical authority. Douglas had walked through this entrance as a student for 8 years. He had written checks to the annual fund for 23 years. He had sat on a facilities advisory panel for 4 years in the early 2000s until the demands of the firm's expansion had made the commitment impractical. He knew this building the way you knew places that had shaped you, with a layered familiarity that contained somewhere beneath the comfort all the things you had accepted without examining, because examining them had never been required. Gregor Aldwell rose from behind his desk when Douglas entered, a man of 57 with silver-framed glasses and conservative institutional presentation, his expression arranged into the carefully calibrated combination of concern and welcome that headmasters develop for conversations with significant donor families. The office was paneled in dark wood and hung with framed photographs of graduating classes and athletic championships and the school's most successful alumni, a gallery of achieved prestige that was intended to reassure visitors that they were in the right place and that the right place had excellent outcomes. Douglas did not sit immediately. He looked at the gallery for a moment and then took the chair. Elliot won't be returning this week. Aldwell settled into his chair with the practiced composure of a man receiving information he had anticipated. We were sorry to hear he's been unwell. How is he? Who supervises the fourth grade athletics module on Friday afternoons? The question arrived in the conversation the way Cora had described sideways specific arriving at the thing it was really asking before the listener had oriented themselves to a new direction. Aldwell blinked behind his glasses. The fourth grade that would be Coach Treadwell, typically. Sometimes Mr. Briggs covers. In the locker room after that module, who's present? A small shift in Aldwell's posture, almost imperceptible. Douglas noted it with the precision of a man who had spent decades reading people across tables. Coach Treadwell oversees the boys' changing period. It's standard practice. Is it standard practice for boys to have their personal belongings moved to other areas of the building on a recurring basis? The shift became more pronounced. Aldwell's hands came together on the desk in a composed gesture that was slightly too deliberate to be casual. If you have a specific concern about where are student incident reports filed when a teacher escalates a concern about peer conduct, Douglas kept his voice even conversational entirely without the heat that the situation wanted from him. What's the internal process? Aldwell removed his glasses with the careful deliberateness of a man buying 3 seconds. Reports are filed with the division director and copied to my office. If a concern rises to a certain threshold, parents are notified. What's the threshold? It's determined case by case based on the severity and frequency of the I'd like to see Mrs. Alderton's file. Douglas let the name arrive without preamble. Whatever she submitted in October. The room changed. Aldwell's composure did not break. It was too well constructed for that. But something at its surface shifted the way the skin of still water shifted when something moved beneath it. His hands separated on the desk and resettled. His mouth opened and closed once before language arrived. I'm not certain which file you're. She sent a communication in October about Elliot's social situation. It was addressed to your office. Douglas looked at the headmaster with the particular patience of a man who had learned 40 years ago in his first commercial negotiation that the person who stopped talking first was usually the person who had something to protect. I'd like to see when it was received and what action followed. The silence lasted 7 seconds. Douglas counted without appearing to count. Aldwell reached for the intercom on his desk and asked his assistant to bring the fourth grade division correspondence file for the fall semester. While they waited, Douglas looked at the framed class photographs on the wall. He found the year he had graduated, 1978, the faces young and formally dressed and arrayed in the confident rows of people who had been told their whole lives that the place they occupied was the right one. He found his own face in the third row and looked at it without particular feeling. The file arrived. Aldwell opened it with the reluctance of a man approaching something that had teeth. He paged through it with his eyes rather than handing it across the desk, and Douglas watched his face the way Cora had taught him to watch, not for the content of the expression, but for the moment it changed. It changed on the fourth page. There it is, Douglas said it without raising his voice. Aldwell looked up. His mouth had settled into a line that communicated beneath its professional evenness the specific discomfort of a man who had made a calculation that had seemed reasonable at the time and was now being asked to defend it to the person most directly harmed by it. I want you to understand the context. Douglas looked at him steadily. I'd like to see when it was received and what action followed. Aldwell set the file down. There was a concern raised by Mrs. Alderton in mid-October regarding the social dynamics within a group of fourth-grade boys. She indicated that Elliot appeared to be experiencing some difficulty with peer relationships and recommended closer supervision during unstructured periods. What action did you take? A breath. We asked the fourth-grade team to monitor the situation. You asked them to monitor it. Douglas looked at him. You did not contact us. At the time the assessment was that the situation you knew in October. The sentence came quietly, which made it louder than any volume would have. My son spent November, December, and the first 2 weeks of January in a bed. I brought 5 physicians into my house. You had information in October that was directly relevant to his condition, and you made a decision not to share it with his parents. Aldwell's hands came back together on the desk. There was a concern about escalating what might have been a temporary peer dynamic into a formal conflict involving prominent families. The intention was to manage it through internal channels before whose children are involved. Another pause. This one had a different quality, not the pause of a man searching for language, but the pause of a man who had arrived at the moment he had been hoping would not arrive. Connor Holloway, Brett Whitfield, and Ryan Ashford. The names settled into the room with the weight of institutional consequence. Remington Holloway had funded the library wing. Preston Whitfield's father sat on the board of trustees. The Ashford family had given the school's endowment its single largest private gift in the institution's history. Douglas knew all 3 men. He had shaken all 3 hands at the annual gala in November, 3 weeks after Mrs. Alderton's email had been filed and set aside. He stood. The movement was measured, not theatrical. He picked up the file from Aldwell's desk. The headmaster did not stop him and looked at the date on Mrs. Alderton's communication. October 14th. He had been at a dinner in Nashville on October 14th, closing a commercial development deal that he had described to Cornelia as the most important transaction of the firm's year. His son had been sitting in a school building that day, carrying whatever that day had required him to carry, and the adults in the building responsible for his safety had read a teacher's concern and chosen institutional preservation over a 10-year-old's dignity. Douglas set the file back on the desk with a precision that communicated everything his voice was not going to. I'll expect a written summary of every internal communication regarding my son from September through today, delivered to my attorney by Friday. He looked at Aldwell with the focused clarity of a man who had spent 4 decades in rooms where the stakes were high and had always known exactly when the negotiating was over. And I'll need the names of the other parents on the board so I can arrange a meeting. Aldwell stood. Douglas, I would strongly urge a measured approach. If this becomes, it's already something. Douglas moved toward the door. You made it something in October when you decided my son was less important than your donor list. He drove home through the same Buckhead roads, this time with the heater running, and Mrs. Alderton's name written on a piece of paper from Aldwell's notepad that he had folded and put in his coat pocket. The dogwood trees along the upper stretch of the road were bare and sculptural against the January sky, their branches holding the shape of the leaves that would come back in April with the patient structural integrity of things that understood their own seasonality. Douglas drove past them without seeing them and thought about Remington Holloway, with whom he had discussed the Nashville deal at the November gala, while their sons were presumably in the same building, occupying the same social world, living inside a situation that one of them had been trying to survive, and the other had been instrumental in making survivable for the wrong child. Cornelia was in the morning room when he returned, the yellow legal pad from the previous night replaced by a fresh one, and the expression on her face when he walked in carried the specific tension of a woman who had been waiting for information and had been using the wait to prepare for several possible versions of it. He told her what Aldwell had said. He told her the names. He watched her face move through the sequence of responses that the names required recognition, the particular revision that came from realizing that people you had been socially proximate to had, through their children, made themselves participants in your son's suffering, and then the composed resolution of a woman who had decided what she was going to do next before the full emotional accounting had finished. "We need to tell Elliot we're not sending him back this week," Cornelia said. "Before anything else." Douglas agreed. They went upstairs together and found Elliot in the armchair by the window. Not the bed, the armchair, which was 8 feet from where he had been confined by the logic of recovery for 11 weeks. He had moved there on his own sometime in the late morning, and the distance was not large, but it was entirely his. Cora was on the window bench with her library book reading with the casual absorption of someone who lived comfortably inside stories, and the room had the quality of a space being used rather than occupied, which was a distinction Douglas was beginning to understand had structural importance. Cornelia sat on the edge of the bed so that she was at Elliot's level. She told him he would not be going back this week without the overqualified language of people who were managing how information landed. She told him plainly, and the plainness was its own kindness. Elliot's shoulders descended by a measure that was visible to everyone in the room. The relief moved across his face with the physical simplicity of weight being set down, not happiness, not recovery, but the immediate and involuntary loosening of a body that had been braced for a blow that had just been called off. "Really?" Douglas looked at his son and said, "Really? And no one is putting you in that car next Monday either." The sentence came out harder than he had intended and softer than the situation warranted, and exactly as true as anything he had said in recent memory. Cora looked up from her book. She looked at Elliot for a moment, then back at the page and did not say anything, which was the right response, because the moment belonged to Elliot and his parents and did not require a narrator. But Douglas noticed the quality of her attention, the way she tracked the room, even while she appeared to be reading the way she had been tracking it all day, and probably for most of her life, monitoring the emotional weather of spaces she occupied, with the practiced vigilance of someone who had learned early that spaces had weather and that reading it correctly mattered. The meeting with the school board was scheduled for the following Monday. Douglas spent the weekend preparing for it with the systematic focus he brought to high-stakes presentations, building the narrative, not from emotion, but from documentation. The October email, the chronology of Elliot's symptoms, the 5 medical consultations, and their collective failure to identify what a Wednesday morning conversation with a 9-year-old had identified in 40 minutes, and the sketchbook. He had found the sketchbook on Saturday afternoon by accident, going through the shelf in Elliot's room, looking for the model aircraft cement that had gone missing and that Cornelia wanted relocated before the cleaning crew came Monday. It was a spiral-bound notebook with a dark green cover, the kind sold in the school supply section of any drugstore, and it had been pushed behind the model aircraft collection with a deliberateness that was distinct from casual misplacement. He stood with it in his hands for a moment before he opened it. The first pages were ordinary, the drawings of a boy with a talent that had not yet found its full vocabulary, a dog with an oversized head, a tree that was more concept than tree, a careful rendering of the east lawn from the second-floor window that had more architectural accuracy than most adults could have managed. Then the middle pages. The shift was not announced. It arrived in the changed pressure of the pencil, lines darker, more compressed, and in the subject matter, which had moved from the observed world into the interior one. A room with rows of lockers rendered in the flat perspective of a child who had not yet learned the technical language of depth, but had grasped its emotional principle. The lockers smaller in the background, the figure of a single boy, smaller still, and 3 larger figures arranged around him in a spatial relationship that required no caption. Another drawing a classroom seen from the back and in the front row, separated from the other figures by the width of a desk, a boy drawn with his shoulders at an angle that Cornelia, when Douglas showed it to her that evening, recognized as the angle of Elliot's shoulders in every recent photograph she had taken. A third drawing dated in the corner in Elliot's small, careful handwriting, October 9th. The date was 5 days before Mrs. Alderton's email. Cornelia looked at the drawings for a long time without speaking. When she did speak, her voice was steady in the way it was steady when she was working very hard to keep it that way. He was telling us. She turned a page. He was telling us in the only language he had available. Douglas looked at the sketchbook in her hands and understood with a completeness that settled into him like something permanent, that his son had been communicating in the only direction that had felt safe, down into paper, into lines and shadow, and the wordless vocabulary of drawn fear. Because the direction that should have been available, the direction of a child toward his parents, had somehow become a road that felt dangerous to travel. That understanding lived in him through the weekend and into Monday morning, when he and Cornelia walked into the board meeting room at Hargrove Preparatory carrying the sketchbook and the documentation in the particular composure of parents who had moved through the initial devastation of knowing and arrived at the second stage, which was the stage of demanding accountability from people who had constructed their professional lives around the avoidance of it. The room had the polished gravity of all such rooms: mahogany table, institutional portraits, the coffee service at the sideboard that communicated that this was a place where serious matters were handled with appropriate ceremony. Aldwell sat at one end with two members of his administrative team. The board members present included a retired judge, two members of Atlanta's established charitable infrastructure, a corporate attorney in Remington Holloway, who had come despite Douglas's expectation that he would not, and who sat with the composed aggression of a man who had decided that visibility was better strategy than absence. Douglas placed the sketchbook in the center of the table without preamble. He did not perform the gesture, he simply set it down and let it be what it was, evidence rendered by a 10-year-old's hand of a fear that had been carried alone for months in a building full of adults paid to notice exactly that kind of thing. The retired judge leaned forward and looked at the drawings without touching them. One of the charitable board members pressed her fingers to her mouth. Aldwell's hands came together on the table. Remington Holloway looked at the drawings and then looked at Douglas. Children draw all kinds of things, without context. Cornelia cut across him with the precision of someone who had prepared this sentence and knew exactly where to place it. My son drew his fear onto paper because there was no adult in that building he trusted enough to speak it to out loud. I am not interested in your context. I am interested in what your son did and what this institution permitted. Holloway's face did not change in the ways faces changed when people were ashamed. It changed in the ways faces changed when people were calculating. If we're going to have this conversation, I think it's important that we're clear about what we can actually establish. October 14th, Douglas said it quietly. That's the date on Mrs. Alderton's email. My son's drawings start in early October. The symptoms that brought 5 physicians into my house began in November. He looked around the table, taking in each face with the systematic attention of a man who had learned to read rooms by reading the people in them. What I'd like to establish is very simple. At what point did this institution's obligation to my son become secondary to its obligation to its donor relationships? The room held the question without answering it, which was its own answer. Holloway leaned back in his chair with the controlled ease of a man who had been in rooms like this one many times and had always left them intact. Douglas, I understand you're upset, but making inflammatory characterizations. Douglas looked at him with the specific flatness of a man who had decided that the usual social architecture of these rooms no longer applied. Your son called my son a princess boy because he doesn't like football. He did it in a locker room where no adult was present, and he did it repeatedly from September until November when Elliot stopped coming to school. I'm not characterizing anything. I'm describing what happened. Holloway's composure developed at its surface the first fracture. Not dramatic. A tightening around the eyes, a slight forward movement of the shoulders, the physical grammar of a man who had been struck somewhere real beneath the official armor. Caleb is 11 years old, and Elliot is 10. Douglas let the arithmetic stand without elaboration. It was the judge who moved the conversation forward, with the practical authority of someone who had spent a career determining what was actionable and what was noise. He asked Aldwell directly whether the institution had a documented obligation to notify parents when a teacher escalated a concern of this nature. Aldwell confirmed that it did. The judge asked whether that obligation had been met in this case. Aldwell confirmed that it had not. That confirmation was the fulcrum. Once it was spoken in the formal register of a board meeting with a retired judge as witness, the conversation's center of gravity shifted from Douglas's grievance to the institution's liability, and institutions, when liability became the operative language, moved with a speed and sincerity that moral argument alone had rarely managed to produce. Cornelia watched Holloway across the table throughout this exchange with the focused intelligence of a woman taking a precise measurement. When the conversation had settled into the procedural, the proposed internal review, the disciplinary steps, the parent notification process, she leaned forward and addressed him directly for the first time since the meeting began. I want you to understand something. This isn't about embarrassing your family or settling a score. My son spent 3 months becoming smaller so he could fit inside a lie he told himself because the truth felt too dangerous to say out loud. She held his gaze with the steady composure of someone who had nothing to defend and therefore nothing to manage. That is what your son's entertainment cost mine. I want you to sit with that number. Holloway did not answer. The absence of his answer was the most truthful thing he had contributed to the room all morning. The board agreed to the review. They agreed to parent notification. They agreed to interim measures pending the investigation's outcome. Aldwell accepted the conditions with the subdued compliance of a man who understood that the alternative was worse. Holloway left without the usual social valedictions of men who were accustomed to departing rooms on their own terms. Douglas and Cornelia walked out through the entrance beneath the Latin motto and across the circular drive to their car, and neither of them spoke until they were past the gate and onto the approach road, with the bare oaks on both sides and the pale January sky pressing down on everything with its particular flat January weight. Cornelia looked straight ahead through the windshield. Her hands were folded in her lap with the composed stillness of someone who had spent everything she had in that room and was taking inventory of what remained. You know what I keep thinking about? Douglas waited. October 14th. I was at the Piedmont Park Conservancy lunch on October 14th. You were in Nashville. She turned to look at him. And Elliot was sitting in a classroom in that building, drawing pictures of the thing he was afraid to tell us. And 6 adults with professional responsibilities toward him had read a teacher's email that morning and decided it was more complicated than it needed to be. Douglas kept his eyes on the road. The bare oaks moved past the windows in the gray January light, and below them, the stone walls ran between the old properties with the immovable permanence of things that had been built to last. He thought about Cora in the window seat that morning with her library book and about the sentence she had said in the foyer that he had been carrying since she said it, the sentence that had not been addressed to him, but that had reached him anyway, the way things reached you when they were true enough. Paying what was owed was not a bargain. It was just what was right. He had spent 40 years building things, structures, deals, relationships, a firm, a reputation, a house on 12 acres with a fountain that ran year-round, because moving water suggested confidence. He had built all of it with the specific and applied intelligence of a man who understood how things worked and how to make them work better. What he had not built, he was beginning to understand, was the particular kind of attention that a child needed from his father. The attention that asked the small question before the large one, that sat at ground level rather than hovering above with authority and concern and the well-funded machinery of problem solving. That kind of attention was not built. It was practiced, and it was not too late to begin. He drove home through the January afternoon to his son and the girl who had known what he had not, and the house at the end of the drive waited for them, with its white columns and its running fountain, and all the rooms inside it where the truth was finally, slowly finding the space it needed to breathe. The week after the board meeting moved through the Hale house with the particular quality of time that followed significant events, slower in some hours, compressed in others, organized not around a clock, but around the small evidence of change that appeared without announcement and required no commentary to be understood. Tuesday morning, Elliot came downstairs before anyone called for him. Wednesday, he asked for scrambled eggs instead of accepting whatever was placed in front of him. Thursday, he spent 40 minutes at the desk in his room with a sketchbook, a different one purchased by Cornelia without remark, and left on the shelf where the old one had been, and what he drew in it was not shown to anyone but was heard in the soft scratching of pencil on paper that reached the hallway through the partly open door. And that sound was its own kind of report. Miriam arrived each morning at 7:15 and moved through the house with a changed quality in her posture, not triumph, nothing as simple as that, but the particular straightness of a woman who had stopped carrying weight that did not belong to her. The medicine tray that had occupied the kitchen counter since mid-November disappeared on Wednesday without ceremony. Douglas came down Thursday morning and noticed its absence, the way you notice the removal of something that had become invisible through familiarity, suddenly completely, with the belated recognition that its presence had been shaping the room's atmosphere in ways he had not consciously registered. He found Miriam in the pantry transferring the last of the prescription bottles to a high shelf behind the bulk dry goods. It did not belong out anymore. She said it without turning around with the matter-of-fact authority of someone who had been making correct assessments of this house for 6 years and had finally been given the standing to act on them. Douglas leaned one shoulder against the pantry door frame and looked at the counter where the tray had been. It looked wider now, more like the kitchen of a house where someone was living rather than a place where something was being managed. "You knew before we did," he said. Miriam finished arranging the shelf and turned to face him with the measured directness she brought to conversations that mattered. "I knew some things didn't fit together. Children's bodies say what their mouths are scared to say. That's not a medical degree. That's just paying attention to the right things." The sentence went into Douglas and stayed there, adding itself to the collection of things said in this house over the past 2 weeks that he was going to be working through for considerably longer than 2 weeks. Cora was at the kitchen island with a fraction worksheet, her pencil moving with the efficient confidence of a child who had decided that mathematics was a problem of logic rather than of memory, and had consequently stopped being afraid of it. She looked up when Douglas came fully into the kitchen. "The fractions, where the bottom numbers are different, they're actually easier," she told him, not because it was relevant, but because it was true, and she was in the habit of saying true things when they occurred to her, regardless of their immediate applicability. Douglas poured his coffee and sat at the island across from her, which was not something he had done before. Sat at the kitchen island on a weekday morning with the household moving around him, and the not having done it before was precisely why he did it. "I spoke to my attorney last night," he told her, "about the school. 2 other families contacted the board after the notifications went out. Their children were targeted starting in September." Cora looked at her worksheet. "Kids without the right last names." "Yes." She wrote a number, erased it, wrote a different one. "That's why they stayed quiet." A pause. "Nobody was going to post a $20,000 notice on a corkboard for them." The sentence did not accuse him. It stated a structural fact about how protection worked in the world she had grown up observing from kitchen islands in service hallways, and it left the weight of that fact precisely where it belonged in the room, available to whoever was willing to pick it up. Douglas picked it up. He sat with it in the way he had been learning to sit with things without immediately converting them into action or deflecting them into abstraction. "No," he said, "they weren't." The investigation's formal expansion was announced the following week. Aldwell submitted his resignation on a Friday afternoon, delivered by email to the board, with the careful language of a man who understood that voluntary departure was preferable to the alternative being assembled around him. Remington Holloway withdrew from the Board of Trustees the same Friday in a letter that his attorney sent to the board chair, and that contained in its third paragraph a sentence expressing regret for any distress his family's association with the school may have caused, which was the grammatical structure of an apology that refused to identify a subject. Preston Whitfield removed his son from enrollment the following Monday and enrolled him in a private school across the county, which solved Preston Whitfield's problem without addressing anything else. Dr. Fenwick came to the house on the following Thursday, 10 days after the board meeting, arriving at the scheduled time with his bag and his professional composure intact. Douglas redirected the visit from the second-floor hallway to his study on the ground floor. Fenwick settled into the leather chair across from the desk. Douglas looked at him and asked the question without prelude. In your 3 months of consultations on Elliot's case, did you ask him directly about his school experience, about whether he was afraid of something specific? Fenwick's composure held, but something behind it shifted. The standard intake process includes a psychosocial component. We ask about school performance, social. Did you ask him if he was afraid to go? A pause. The pause was his own answer, but Fenwick provided the spoken version with the integrity of a man who understood what honesty cost him here and was going to pay it. The presentation was consistent with a somatic response to stress. I noted that. I recommended a behavioral specialist consultation, which I pursued in the wrong direction because you framed it as an adjunct to the physiological investigation rather than the primary line of inquiry. Douglas did not raise his voice. You treated the symptoms with considerable skill and missed the cause entirely. Fenwick removed his glasses and held them in his hands. If the child was not forthcoming about the source of the stress, he was 10 years old and terrified and had decided that the adults in his life were asking the wrong questions. Douglas leaned forward slightly. You were one of those adults. So was I. I'm not telling you that to assign blame. I'm telling you because the question you didn't ask cost my family 4 months and cost my son considerably more than that. Fenwick sat with this for a moment, which Douglas respected. You're right that the inquiry should have been broader. His voice had lost its clinical register and found something more human beneath it. I treated the body and trusted the behavior. I should have been more curious about why the behavior had the particular shape it had. Douglas looked at him steadily. Yes, you should have. The call from Sandra Ashford came on a Saturday morning in late January, and Cornelia took it in the morning room with the door half open, which was how Douglas heard it. He was passing in the hallway with a cup of coffee and stopped without intending to, and stood there the way people stood when they understood that the conversation on the other side of a door was one they needed to hear. Sandra Ashford was Dean Ashford's wife, and she had not been at the board meeting, and her call was not the call of a woman executing a legal strategy. It was the call of a woman who had been carrying something for a considerable period of time and had reached the point where the weight of it had become greater than the risk of setting it down. Cornelia listened for most of the call, which told Douglas something about its content. Cornelia did not listen long to things that did not warrant sustained attention. What Sandra Ashford said in the careful and slightly unsteady voice of someone speaking a truth they had rehearsed but not yet made fully comfortable was that Ryan had been using language at home for several months, that she had found troubling language about weak boys and strong boys, about which kinds of boys deserved what happened to them, about how certain boys needed to learn things the hard way. She had raised it with Dean twice. Both times he had told her it was normal that boys talk that way, that she was misreading the register of ordinary male competition. She had accepted this the first time and not fully accepted it the second time, and had been living in the space between acceptance and refusal for the better part of 4 months. Cornelia, when Sandra Ashford finished, said something that Douglas heard clearly through the half-open door. The language Ryan learned at school started somewhere before school. I'm not calling to prosecute your family. I'm calling to tell you that it cost my son something real, and I think you know where it came from, and I think you called me because you're not willing to let it continue. Sandra Ashford's response was inaudible from the hallway. Cornelia's voice came back even and clear. Then that's where it has to stop, and that's your work to do, not mine. Douglas moved away from the door before Cornelia finished the call because the conversation was hers and he had heard what he needed to hear. He went upstairs to Elliot's room where Cora and Elliot were engaged in a disagreement about a card game that had the energetic quality of an argument between people who were enjoying the argument more than either of them was willing to admit. Elliot had the baseball glove on the chair beside him, not on his hand, but close enough that it was within reach, which was different from the shelf. Douglas sat on the edge of the armchair and waited for a natural break in the card game argument. And when one came, he asked Elliot in the deliberate quietness of someone who had been practicing smaller questions, whether the name Sandra Ashford meant anything to him. Elliot looked up. His expression moved through recognition and then through the specific wariness of a child who had learned to evaluate the safety of adult conversations before entering them. Ryan's mom. She called your mother this morning. Elliot's hands tightened on his cards. She knows what Ryan did, Douglas told him, maintaining the quiet register. She's known for a while. She called because she wants it to stop. The tightening in Elliot's hands did not immediately release. Children who had spent months bracing for impact did not unbrace in the space of a single sentence, and Douglas had learned enough by now not to expect them to. But something changed in Elliot's face. A small revision, like a correction made to a calculation that had been producing wrong answers, the body's quiet acknowledgement that the mathematics of the situation had changed by one variable, which changed the outcome. Cora looked at Elliot over her cards and said nothing. She had the gift of knowing when silence was more useful than comfort, which was a gift that most adults took decades to develop, and she appeared to have arrived with. Elliot looked at his father and asked in a voice that was working to be steady, "Is this going to make things worse for me?" Douglas looked at his son, this specific boy with his particular combination of sensitivity and resilience. His talent for drawing what he could not say, his capacity for loyalty to, a silence he should never have been required to keep, and answered with the kind of directness he had been practicing for 2 weeks, the kind that did not dress the truth in the soft clothing of reassurance before determining whether the truth required it. No, none of what happens next is yours to carry. It belongs to the adults who made it possible and the institution that protected, but you were wronged. That's the fact we're starting from. Elliot absorbed this. The absorption was visible and took time because facts of that particular kind, the kind that reversed a child's understanding of his own culpability in what had happened to him, did not settle quickly. They settled the way structural changes settled, with weight and permanence and a slight trembling at the surface before everything stabilized. Cora put down a card and looked at Elliot with the plain directness that was her signature. "See, that's what I told you." She said it without triumph, as a simple confirmation of something she had said earlier and was now being externally validated, which was satisfying not because she had been right, but because Elliot now had a second source for the truth. Elliot looked at her. Something moved across his face that was closer to a smile than anything Douglas had seen on his son in 4 months. And it arrived without any of the conscious effort that smiles had required recently. It arrived the way things arrived when they came from somewhere real. The formal outcome of the board investigation was delivered in writing to Douglas's attorney on the second Friday of February. Aldwell's resignation was accepted. A new interim head was appointed from outside the institution, a woman named Dr. Patricia Selden, who came recommended by the State Education Board, and whose first public statement included the phrase "zero tolerance for sustained peer intimidation," which was the kind of language that could mean everything or nothing, depending on whether the institution backing it had changed or merely changed its vocabulary. Douglas was cautiously prepared for either possibility and had instructed his attorney to remain involved through the spring semester regardless. Connor Holloway, Brett Whitfield, and Ryan Ashford were each subject to disciplinary review under the interim administration, the outcomes of which were communicated to their respective families in private. Whitfield had already removed Brett from the school, which resolved his family's exposure without resolving anything of moral substance. Holloway kept Connor enrolled through the transition, which Douglas noted and filed as information. Sandra Ashford enrolled Ryan in counseling that she had arranged herself before the school required it, which Douglas also noted and filed differently. The two families who had come forward after the notification letters were meeting with Dr. Selden's office. Their children had names Marcus Ellerby and Owen Pfeiffer, and Douglas learned their names from his attorney and wrote them on a piece of paper he kept in the inner pocket of his coat for a week before transferring it to his desk drawer, because having their names written down and kept close felt like the minimum acknowledgement available to him, and he was not yet certain what the appropriate maximum was. He and Cornelia discussed this on a Sunday evening in the sitting room off the master bedroom, the room where Cornelia did her most serious thinking. She sat with her legal pad, and he sat across from her with nothing in his hands, which was unusual enough that she looked at him over the pad and waited. "I want to do something for those families," he said, "something that doesn't look like a man with a guilty conscience buying his way out of a bad feeling." Cornelia considered this with the serious attention it deserved. "Then it can't be money directly." She turned the pen in her fingers. "It needs to be structural, something that exists regardless of whether you feel good about it." The conversation that followed produced the outline of what would become 3 months later a funded position at Elliot's new school, where a dedicated student advocate whose sole responsibility was confidential access for any child who needed to report something they did not feel safe reporting through official channels. It was a small thing in the scale of institutional reform. It was also a specific thing designed in direct response to the specific failure that had cost two families 4 months and two other families considerably longer. And specificity of that kind had a durability that general goodwill did not. The meeting with Miriam took place on a Tuesday in the second week of February in the study with Cornelia present. Douglas had asked Aldous Crane to step back from the household management of the payroll process the previous week in a conversation that Crane had received with the brittle dignity of a man who understood that the step back was only partly administrative. Crane remained on staff in a reduced capacity because Douglas was a practical man, and Crane knew the operational details of the estate with a thoroughness that could not be replaced quickly, but the authority structure had been revised in ways that Crane understood and did not contest, because contesting them would have required him to defend the choices he had made in October and November, and defunding them was not something he was equipped to do. Miriam came into the study and looked at the chair across from Douglas's desk, and then at the chair beside Cornelia near the window, and chose without apparent deliberation to sit in neither until Douglas gestured toward the desk chair, and she evaluated the gesture and decided to accept it, sitting with the composed straightness of a woman who was not going to perform either deference or combativeness, and had settled on simple grounded presence as the register appropriate to the conversation. Douglas told her about the position he was offering, household director, with genuine managerial authority over staff scheduling, payroll oversight, vendor management, and the operational integrity of the estate's domestic systems. He told her the salary, which was specific and fair, and did not require her to negotiate upward from an insultingly low opening number, because Douglas had decided that the insultingly low opening number was a tactic designed to establish a power differential that he was no longer interested in maintaining. He told her that payroll would be processed on the 1st and 15th of every month without exception, and that any future deviation from that schedule would require her written approval, because the fund that had been reallocated in November without her knowledge or consent was a thing that could not be undone, but could be made structurally impossible to repeat. Miriam listened to all of this with the careful attention of a woman evaluating not just what was being offered, but the spirit in which it was being offered, and whether the spirit was durable or situational. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, in the way she was quiet when she was deciding something, and then she looked at Douglas with the directness that he had come to understand was not confrontational, but was simply the only register she operated in when something important was being discussed. "I have 3 conditions," she said. "Not negotiations, conditions." Douglas nodded once. "Staff in this house get treated like adults. not thanked for doing their jobs in the voice people use with children who've done something unexpectedly impressive. Treated like adults who are competent and have made a choice to be here and deserve to have that choice respected every day, not just when something goes right. She looked at him steadily. Second, if anyone who works here has a concern about anything about a family member, about something they have noticed, they have a way to raise it that doesn't cost them their position. Not a suggestion box, an actual conversation with an actual person who has the authority to do something. Douglas held both conditions without minimizing them. And the third, Miriam's hands rested in her lap with the composed stillness of someone who had been thinking about this third condition for longer than the past 2 weeks. Cora doesn't belong to this house. She helped your son because she's the kind of person she is not because she was available for it. She is my daughter, and she is going to go back to her school and her life in this a small, precise, and deliberate. This stays here. Your gratitude, your fondness, whatever you've been feeling since that first morning, it stays here. You do not reach into her future because you feel that you owe her something. You owe me something, and you settle that by treating me the way I just described. Cora is not part of the transaction. The study was very quiet. Cornelia near the window looked at Miriam with an expression that carried multiple things at once: respect, a complicated recognition, in the particular honesty of a woman confronted by another woman's precision and finding it entirely without flaw. That's the right condition, Cornelia said. Douglas looked at Miriam for a moment without speaking, and what he was doing was not calculating or measuring or deciding. He was simply receiving with the full attention he had been practicing the clear statement of a mother who had raised a daughter worth protecting and intended to keep doing so, regardless of what the house around her was offering. All three, he said, without reservation. Miriam nodded, not with warmth, not with coldness, with the clean acknowledgement of something that had been agreed to in plain language and therefore required no elaboration. When Miriam left the study, Douglas looked at his wife, and Cornelia looked back at him with the expression she used when something had happened in a room that was going to take a while to fully absorb. She called it correctly, Cornelia said. Every word. Yes. He turned the pen on the desk. Every word. The meeting with Elliot that evening was simpler. Douglas came into the room where Elliot was sitting at the window desk with the new sketchbook open and a pencil in his hand drawing the east lawn from above in a way that had more depth than anything in the old one. The perspective more controlled, the lines more confident, the shadows placed with an accuracy that suggested he had been thinking about where the light came from and rendering it rather than just recording the surface of things. Douglas stood at his shoulder for a moment before Elliot looked up, and what he saw in the drawing was the lawn he had looked at through the east window for 31 years, rendered by his son's hand in a way that made it look new. He sat on the window bench and said, "The school made a decision. Aldwell is gone. The three boys have been through formal review." He watched Elliot's face as it moved through this information with the careful, specific attention of a child parsing news for its practical implications rather than its narrative weight. "You're not going back there, but I want to make sure you understand why not, because we're protecting you from it, but because what that place did and what those boys did was wrong, and you do not have to return to a place that failed you and call it resilience." Elliot set the pencil down. He looked at his drawing and then at his father and said in a voice that had recovered some of its ordinary register, "Can I ask you something?" "Yes." "Did I make it worse by not telling you sooner?" The question moved through Douglas with the particular weight of things that children asked when they had been carrying blame that did not belong to them for long enough that it had started to feel structural. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees at the level of the conversation rather than above it. "No, you made the calculation that was available to you with the information you had about what was safe to say and to whom. That calculation was wrong, but I gave you the information that made it wrong. That's mine." Elliot looked at him for a moment with the evaluative attention of a child determining whether an adult's statement was reflexive reassurance or considered truth. He found what he needed in Douglas's face, which had the particular openness of someone who had stopped managing their expression and started simply having one. "Okay," he said. The word was quiet and entire. They sat together at the window for a while after that, not saying much, watching the last of the January light fall across the east lawn in the long horizontal angle that light took in the late afternoon of winter, touching the tops of the dormant grasses with the temporary gold of something that was not yet spring, but was no longer fully winter either. Douglas thought about the magnolias he had planted 31 years ago and the way they had grown in the time since past the window and past the roof line following the available light, with the patient structural logic of things that did not hurry toward anything but did not stop either. March arrived and the house moved with it. The dogwood trees along the drive began their annual white emergence quiet and insistent, and the fountain that ran year-round acquired in the warmer air a different sound, less austere, more like the sound of something returning rather than something persisting. The grounds crew came on Thursdays as they always had and worked in the lower garden with the tools of reanimation rather than maintenance, turning the soil around the rose beds and cutting back the hydrangeas to their structural canes. The east lawn lost its winter color and went to the pale, tentative green that preceded the real green of April. And Elliot watched all of this from inside and increasingly from outside. He had been enrolled at Millbrook Day School in the first week of March, a smaller institution 15 minutes west of Buckhead built on a converted estate property with a main building that had none of Hargrove's architectural authority and considerably more of the ordinary warmth of a place that had been used for generations by people who genuinely liked being in it. The head of school was a woman named Dr. Evelyn Marsh, who had spent 20 years in public education before moving to Millbrook, and who spoke to new students at enrollment not about the school's achievements, but about its commitments, which she described in the specific and unflinching language of someone who understood the difference between institutional aspiration and institutional practice, and intended to be accountable to both. Elliot's first day was a Tuesday in early March. Douglas drove him, which had been agreed to in advance, and Cornelia did not come, which had also been agreed to in advance because Elliot had specifically requested a transition that did not require him to manage his parents' emotions in addition to his own. Douglas pulled up to the main building entrance and cut the engine and did not reach for anything inspirational to say because he had been learning for 2 months that the inspirational thing was usually the thing the parent needed and the child did not. "You want me to wait out here?" He kept his voice level informational. Elliot looked at the school entrance, the ordinary institutional doors, the small groups of students moving in and out without the particular social vigilance that had characterized every school entrance Elliot had approached since September. He looked for a moment with the evaluation of someone who has learned to read a space before entering it, and what he appeared to read in this entrance was the possibility not yet confirmed that it might be different. "No," he said, "I'm good." Douglas nodded. Elliot got out of the car and walked to the entrance without looking back. And Douglas sat in the parked car and watched his son walk through the door and understood with the full weight of everything the past 4 months had cost and taught that the not looking back was a gift, not indifference, not forgetting, but the first concrete evidence that Elliot was moving towards something rather than away from it, which was a direction Douglas had not seen him take in a very long time. He drove home through the March morning with the windows down for the first time since fall, and the air that came in carried the particular smell of early spring in Georgia damp soil and green things beginning, and the faint sweetness of the dogwood that was everywhere along these roads in this season, and Douglas breathed it in with the uncomplicated gratitude of someone who had stopped taking the continued availability of ordinary beauty for granted. Cora was at the kitchen island when he returned working on a project for school that involved a large sheet of poster board and several colored markers and a degree of organizational commitment that suggested she had been at it for some time. Miriam was in the East Wing, and the kitchen had the comfortable inhabited quality it had acquired since Miriam had taken her new position, and the house had stopped orienting itself around crisis. Douglas poured his coffee and sat at the island across from Cora, which he did now without noting it, the way you stopped noting things that had become ordinary. He watched her work on the poster for a moment, which appeared to involve a diagram of the water cycle rendered with more artistic attention than was strictly required for a fourth-grade science project. "Elliot went in," he said. Cora looked up. "Good." She went back to the poster. He didn't look back. She put the cap on the blue marker and selected the green one. "That's better." A pause. When you stop looking back at the thing you're scared of, it means you've started looking at something else. Douglas held this for a moment. He had been collecting Cora's sentences for 2 months the way you collected things you intended to return to, and he found that they held their value on repeated review. "Can I ask you something?" Cora looked at him with the full attention she brought to things she considered worth attending to. "You came into this house 4 months ago, and you saw something 5 specialists missed, and you said what you saw in front of a room full of adults who had every reason not to hear it." He looked at her directly. "Why did you do it the way you did? Not the part about the wages, I understand that. The part where you told me what was wrong with my son." Cora considered the question with a seriousness that matched his asking of it. She set the green marker down and looked at her poster for a moment, and then at him. "Because someone needed to say it before it got worse." A pause that was neither evasive nor decorative. "And because helping somebody doesn't mean you get to have them." The sentence rearranged something in Douglas, the way the best of her sentences did unexpectedly and completely. He had been thinking about what he owed Cora for 4 months, and the sentence told him with the clean logic of her characteristic precision that the frame of owing was exactly wrong. She had not done what she did in order to create a debt. She had done it because it was in her nature to see clearly and speak directly, and because nothing in her particular combination of courage and clarity allowed her to see a child in a bed who needed a different kind of help and say nothing. That was not a transaction. That was a person being who she was. "Your mother said the same thing," Douglas told her. Cora picked up the green marker. "My mother's usually right." He laughed. The sound surprised him slightly, not because laughing was unusual, but because this particular laugh had nothing performed in it, nothing managed or modulated, just the genuine response of a man who had found something actually funny in the completely ordinary way. Cora did not look up from her poster, but the corner of her mouth moved in the way he had come to recognize as her version of acknowledging something that pleased her without making a production of it. He took his coffee to the study and sat at the desk and opened his email and found at the top of the queue a message from Dr. Selden at Hargrove with a subject line that read, "Formal Investigation Completion Summary Report." He read it in full, and what it confirmed was what he had known since the Monday of the board meeting, that the institution had chosen institutional preservation over a child's safety, and had done so not through malice, but through the more mundane and durable mechanism of structural self-protection, which was harder to prosecute than malice, and in its way more damaging because it did not require anyone to be a villain. It only required everyone to be slightly more comfortable with the status quo than with the discomfort of disrupting it. He saved the report to his attorney folder and closed the email and looked out the study window at the east lawn where the early March light was doing something particular to the color of the grass, the way light in early spring made green look like a decision rather than a fact, deliberate and slightly urgent. He thought about Elliot in the new school walking through the door without looking back. He thought about Miriam moving through the house with the authority of someone who had earned it and been recognized for having earned it, and about the conversation in the study where she had set down her 3 conditions without apology or qualification, and about the way Cornelia had looked at her afterward with the expression she used for things that were exactly right. The afternoon of the last day Cora came to the house before Miriam moved to her restructured schedule, a schedule that no longer required Cora to come along, because Miriam was now a salaried director whose hours were defined rather than open-ended, and Cora was going back to her own school's after-care program, which cost money that Miriam now had. Douglas found Cora on the back terrace with her canvas bag over her shoulder and the library book in her hand, waiting for Miriam to bring the car around from the service drive. He came out through the French doors and stood on the terrace with her in the late afternoon light, which was warm in the way of late March, carrying the first real warmth of the year, rather than just the absence of cold. Cora looked out at the lower garden, which the grounds crew had been working on all week, and which had the opened, expectant look of ground that had been prepared for something. "The roses come back in April," Douglas told her. "Cornelia has been working on that bed for 15 years. Cora looked at the rose bed with the serious appreciation she brought to things that had taken a long time to get right. "That's a long time to work on something. She says the best things usually take longer than you plan." Cora considered this. "My mama says that too, about me." Douglas looked at her, this small, clear-eyed girl who had walked into his house with a worksheet and a library book, and had looked at everything in it with the particular seeing of someone who had not been taught to look away from what was uncomfortable, and who had named in the language of plain truth the thing that had been in the room for months, waiting for someone to simply say it out loud. He had been thinking about what to say to her at this moment for several days, and he had discarded several versions of it because they had all been too large, too weighted with the significance he wanted to attach to her departure, and largeness was exactly wrong. "You know what I've learned?" He kept his voice at the conversational level she had always used, the level that did not perform anything. "Knowing the difference between something getting better and something actually being fixed is harder than it sounds." Cora turned from the rose bed and looked at him with the full attention she gave to things she was evaluating carefully. She was quiet for a moment in the genuine way, not the performed way, and then she said, "Better is usually more honest." Another pause. "Fixed is what people say when they want to be done thinking about it." Douglas looked out in the lower garden where the ground had been turned and the bare canes of the rose bushes stood in their prepared beds, with the structural patience of things that understood they were going to flower again and were not in a hurry about it. "Then we're aiming for better," he said. Cora nodded once with the clean economy of someone for whom a nod was sufficient and embellishment was not in her vocabulary. She heard Miriam's car on the service drive and shifted her bag on her shoulder and moved toward the terrace steps. She stopped at the top of the steps and looked back at him, not with the look of someone checking the room's temperature before committing to a direction, but with the look of someone who had done what she came to do and was leaving because leaving was what came next, not because there was anything unfinished. "Don't ask Elliot big questions when he gets home today," she said. It was the last piece of advice she had, practical and specific and exactly calibrated to the moment it was designed for. "Just ask what the cafeteria was like." Douglas looked at her. "That's a small question." "That's the point." She went down the terrace steps and across the garden path toward the service drive, her shoes quiet on the stone, her bag over one shoulder, not looking back again because there was nothing behind her that required it. The afternoon light fell across the garden with the particular completeness of late March light in Georgia, golden and unhurried, touching the tops of the rose canes in the newly turned earth, and the far edge of the lawn where the magnolias caught it in their upper branches and held it there for a moment before the angle changed and it moved on. Douglas stood on the terrace until the sound of Miriam's car had faded down the drive, and then he stood there a little longer in the quiet of the property, listening to the fountain and the birds in the upper magnolias and the distant sounds of the grounds crew packing their tools for the week. He thought about all the rooms in this house where the truth had finally been allowed to be itself: the foyer, the upstairs bedroom, the boardroom, the study, the kitchen island, and about what those rooms would be, now going forward carrying the weight of what had been said in them in the lighter air of houses that had stopped protecting the wrong things. Then he went inside to wait for his son to come home from school with a small question ready and the patience finally to hear the answer.